Legal identity, nationality, and jurisdictional choice in United States law. 1. Scope and core questions. You examine how legal identity, nationality, and venue determine your rights and liabilities under United States law, with emphasis on definitions of person, pathways to nationality, and the boundaries of civil and commercial jurisdiction. Footnote. You focus on how status and place control obligations and protections in practice. 2. Persons and dual capacities. You distinguish between a living human recognized in law and artificial entities recognized as persons such as corporations, trusts, estates, associations, and partnerships. You treat the state-created entity linked to your name as an agency vehicle through which you may interact with civil government, while you act as agent or representative for that entity when you transact. Footnote. You separate natural capacity from artificial capacity to avoid conflating duties and liabilities. 3. Status correction as identity and location. You define status correction as 2 tasks. First, you identify all persons you operate, such as your individual capacity and any entities you control. Second, you determine the legal location of each person because location sets jurisdiction for regulation, taxation, and remedies. Footnote. You treat status correction as an ongoing allocation of identities and venues rather than a single filing. 4. Federal and corporate geography. You rely on statutory text that defines United States as a federal corporation and places its legal location within the District of Columbia, and you treat corporate state entities as components within that federal sphere. You distinguish those entities from the unincorporated states known historically as the United States of America. Footnote. You differentiate federal corporate venues from unincorporated state venues to map jurisdiction. 5. Nationality, allegiance, and passports. You parse nationality as the status of a person who owes allegiance to a state, and you emphasize that nationality may be conferred after birth by any means whatsoever. You distinguish a citizen of the United States from a non-citizen national of the United States and note that allegiance supports passport issuance and employment authorization. Footnote. You show that allegiance-based nationality can secure documents and work eligibility without citizenship. 6. Elections that create tax liability. You analyze rules dividing resident and non-resident alien individuals for income tax purposes and the election that allows a non-resident to be treated as a resident for tax computation. You link taxpayer status to being subject to an internal revenue tax, and you note that the system is described as based on voluntary compliance. Footnote. You frame tax exposure as arising from definitional status and elective filings rather than mere presence. 7. Contracts, licensing, and everyday jurisdiction. You treat signatures on forms such as licenses, voter registrations, and information returns as acts that identify a particular legal person and place that person in a stated venue. You characterize traffic tickets as complaints that presuppose a contractual relationship with the issuing entity. Footnote. You caution that routine paperwork can supply identity and venue admissions used to enforce rules. 8. The 14th Amendment and dual citizenship. You present the view that post-war constitutional changes and interpretations such as the slaughterhouse cases created dual citizenship categories and expanded federal corporate jurisdiction. You also reference later congressional materials that questioned ratification and scope. Footnote. You connect federal expansion to dual status doctrines and disputed historical adoption. 9. Common law harms and public order. You contrast commercial code-based enforcement with a harms-based framework that centers on an injured party. You propose local self-governance through sheriffs and juries as a path that prioritizes restitution and protection over regulatory fines. Footnote. You elevate injury and restitution as the baseline for coercive power. 10. Monetary flows and institutional roles. You assert that income remittances administered under federal revenue procedures primarily service national debt obligations rather than local services, and that organizational forms in the revenue chain are not simple line agencies. You recommend using discovery tools to test claims about destinations and authorities. Footnote. You urge evidentiary requests to verify where remittances go and who controls them. 11. Practical program for risk management. You maintain one identity within regulated markets while clarifying the roles and venues of your other persons. You favor allegiance-based nationality for documentation, careful use of filings to avoid unintended elections, diversified custody, and readiness to litigate pro se using public records and sworn statements. Footnote. You balance participation with venue discipline to preserve options and reduce exposure. 12. Strategic implications for individuals. You act early to delineate which person bears which obligation, you relocate entities where lawful advantages exist, and you reserve proofs of identity and venue in writing. You document every representation and avoid unnecessary contracts that expand corporate jurisdiction over you. Footnote. You operationalize status choices through written records that control how rules attach.